All right, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So in this video, we're going to be talking about issues related to personality disorders. So there are three major classes of personality disorders, and so we'll discuss those and the disorders that go into each group. And then we will also talk a little bit about where personality comes from. And in this lecture video, we will talk about Activity 12, which is the last activity of the semester. So refer back to my earlier announcements about the fact that you do get to drop grades for activities. Sometimes students will email me asking if they can switch out an activity drop grade for an exam drop grade, but that's not the case. The drop grades are specifically for the activities. If you have questions about the content or about your grades, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and get into lecture.
Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about personality disorders. Now, before we can talk about personality disorders, we have to say a little bit about what we mean when we use the word personality. So, personality is a word that gets used a good bit. We feel like we have a general idea of what personality means, but it's a word that may be a little bit difficult to define. So, first of all, your personality is unique to you. So there is something about your personality that makes you different from other people. And also, your personality impacts your behavior. Now, I wouldn't say that every behavior, everything that we do, is perfectly aligned with our personality. Certainly, there are times when the environment dictates what we do, and then our personality might not actually be the chief influence on our behavior. But for the most part, our personality determines our behavior. And a healthy personality is a personality that is a combination of both consistency and flexibility. So, first of all, your personality tends to be relatively consistent over time once you get to a certain age. So, you're going to see that these disorders that we talk about today are not appropriate to diagnose in children. We're going to wait until an individual is an adult before we say that a personality is set. But your personality is fairly consistent over time and is marked by what we call traits. Now, towards the end of today's lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we mean these traits. But these personality traits are relatively consistent over time. They do impact your behavior. However, your personality is also somewhat flexible. So if your environment changes, then your personality might change a little bit too. So if, for example, a person gets a new job that requires that person to interact with other people more, then over time that person's personality might become flexible a little bit and might be a little bit more social, a little bit more extroverted. So your personality can change a little bit based on the environment. Now, what you're going to see is that for individuals who have personality disorders, they typically do not have that flexible component, which is going to be a problem because individuals who have personality disorders have some personality traits that are not working out well for them. And because these personality traits are very difficult to change, this is going to make therapy very complicated. So what is a personality disorder? Well, as we just said, a person who has a personality disorder has an inflexible pattern. So their personality is not willing to change, really is not impacted by the environment or by what is adaptive. So there could be a trait in a person's personality that is harmful to relationships, for example, but that person feels like there's not anything they can do to change that trait. This pattern is going to be seen in most interactions for years at a time. And this is why we don't diagnose a personality disorder in someone who is maybe a child or even a teenager. We need to see a pattern that is fairly consistent for a number of years. Now, this pattern is going to be harmful, obviously. If we had a person whose personality was consistent and lasted for years, but was serving them really well and was very functional and was not causing anyone distress, then obviously we wouldn't be calling this a disorder. So we're saying a person has an inflexible pattern that continues for a long period of time, and that their particular personality traits cause psychological pain for that person or perhaps for other people or both. So you're going to see that personality disorders oftentimes have a huge impact on relationships, whether that be romantic relationships or potentially relationships with friends or family members or coworkers. These individuals often have a very difficult time getting along with other people, but then, as we're going to see, there are some other things outside of relationships that may be difficult. So there are certain personality traits that make, for example, going to work and paying the bills difficult. So we're going to see a wide range of dysfunction with personality disorders. So generally speaking, before we talk about any particular diagnoses, we have the criteria here for a personality disorder. A person has a long-term, rigid pattern of behavior that's causing dysfunction. And that dysfunction may impact the way they think, the way they feel, their relationships with other people. It talks about impulsivity here. So this could be impacting a person's ability to make decisions, for example. You'll see that as we go through these. And also, the pattern, in addition to being dysfunction, is also deviant. So we're talking about a pattern that is different from what we typically find in our culture. So as culture changes, our perspective on what a healthy personality looks like also changes. And so you're going to see distress or impairment as well. Now, with the DSM-5, our latest version of the DSM, the way they ended up classifying personality disorders is to have 10 personality disorders split into 3 categories or clusters. Now, this is not a revolutionary way of thinking of personality disorders. This is fairly consistent with the DSM-4 as well. But the DSM-5 almost went with a different classification system for personality disorders. And there are some individuals that are in favor of that new system. And so when we see the next version come out, there may be a change in the way personality disorders are classified. So we will touch on what that new system might look like towards the end of today's lecture. But for the moment, we're going to go with what the DSM-5 says. So the DSM-5 splits personality disorders into 3 groups or clusters. Now, the clusters, the reason they call them clusters is that the symptoms tend to cluster together. So if we're talking about, for example, odd or eccentric behaviors, these individuals might have symptoms of all 3 or at least 2 of these disorders. Even if a person only meets criteria for one, they are likely to have some overlap and perhaps have some of the symptoms of the other disorders. So they cluster together in that they often go together. We see them together. If a person has one dramatic personality disorder, then they might have more than one, or at least have symptoms of another dramatic personality disorder. Now, is it possible for a person to have an odd personality disorder but also perhaps have symptoms of anxiety or some anxious personality disorders? Yes, it is possible for that, but typically they cluster together. Now, one other thing to note as far as terminology goes is that the odd or eccentric behavior cluster is called cluster A. Dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior, this is cluster B. And then anxious or fearful behavior, this is cluster C. So you may hear me use those terms, cluster A, cluster B, cluster C, but they're referring to these different categories. So we have 10 disorders that are put into 3 categories. And the first category we're going to talk about would be the cluster A, or odd personality disorders. So this cluster includes schizotypal, paranoid, and schizoid personality disorders. Now, what you're going to see as we go through and talk about each of these personality disorders in a little bit of detail, you're going to see that a lot of these symptoms will look similar to our lecture that we had on psychotic disorders. So one thing I do want to say briefly is that there are so many different disorders to talk about today that we're just going to have to kind of generally skim over some of the research on these. But of course, if you're interested, then I'm sure you can find other resources to just further your own personal knowledge on this. So personality disorders, very fascinating group of disorders. When we're talking about cluster A personality, we're talking about symptoms that are similar to schizophrenia. So the individual who has a personality disorder in the first cluster, cluster A, has symptoms of schizophrenia that are similar to schizophrenia but not as extensive as. So a person who has schizophrenia typically goes through phases where they have severe symptoms, and then they may also have phases where they have mild or no symptoms. On the other hand, a person who has an odd personality disorder would have similar symptoms, but the symptoms would be less severe and longer lasting than an individual who has schizophrenia. Now, some individuals would say we're drawing a distinction here where there isn't one, and perhaps instead of thinking of these as personality disorders, perhaps we should be thinking of them as schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So a disorder that has similar symptoms that are more mild and longer lasting could perhaps go under the psychotic disorders section, but for the moment they're listed as personality disorders. So you're going to see these behaviors that are similar to psychotic symptoms can include extreme suspiciousness, social withdrawal, peculiar ways of thinking and perceiving things. So when we talked about psychotic disorders, things like delusions, things like hallucinations, things like social issues. And so you're going to see these things coming back up. So our first disorder to talk about is paranoid personality disorder. This is an odd or cluster A personality disorder that is characterized by a deep distrust and suspicion of other people. So just as it sounds, a person who has paranoid personality disorder is a person who has significant difficulty trusting anyone. Now, we probably all have trust issues to a certain extent, and perhaps that's healthy if we've had individuals who have hurt us before. To not give a person back your trust may be healthy in those situations. But when we're talking about someone who has paranoid personality disorder, this is a person who mistrusts other people even if those individuals don't give them reason to mistrust them. So a person who has basically delusions about other people. Now, these suspicions may not actually be severe enough to call a delusion, but they have beliefs about other people that are not really supported by the way other people have treated them or the way other people have acted. So this is a strange thought about another person that we really don't have evidence for. And so you can see the break from reality here, and that a person has excessive mistrust of other people. Now, if you're an individual who severely struggles with trusting other people, it would make sense for you to isolate yourself, because it would be very stressful for this individual to try to be around other people. And so you may see social isolation as well. Now, why is it that some individuals have these severe paranoid thought processes? Well, several different ideas. Briefly, all of this should sound familiar by now because you've heard of these different theoretical orientations. So, just as you would expect, a psychodynamic theorist might say, demanding parents. Your parents were not giving you the affection and the love that you needed. So maybe you didn't learn to trust and to attach to other people in a healthy way when you were a child. Perhaps there's a cognitive issue here where a person has an attribution or an assumption or an attitude about other people that is, first of all, not accurate, because there are some individuals that are trustworthy. And second of all, is not helpful, because this is going to hurt a person in their relationships. So some maladaptive assumptions here. And of course, a biological perspective will say that there's something genetic going on. Now, when it comes to genetics and personality, that's very tricky, as you can imagine, because let's say, for example, that you behave in ways that are similar to your mom. Well, is that because your mom gave you certain genetics, or is that because you were raised by your mom and so you're modeling her behavior? Don't know that for sure. Could be a combination of both. How do we treat individuals who have paranoid personality disorder? Well, as you could imagine, it's tricky. And as it says, in general, personality disorders are very difficult to treat because individuals who have personality disorders, first of all, they may not realize that there's a problem, and they may have some interpersonal issues that make it hard for them to connect with a therapist. So imagine how difficult it would be if you were a person who did not trust anyone to go sit down and talk openly and honestly with a therapist who you don't know. So if an individual does come to treatment, it may be because someone else kind of forced them to go to treatment, or at least strongly encouraged them to go to treatment. Or it may be a situation where they're having a certain problem, maybe something specific, like I need to drink a little less, that kind of thing. And so they're willing to get help with that specific problem, but not willing to get help with the personality issues. So as you might expect, they may not develop good relationships with the psychologist, and this can be a real hindrance to progress. So you can try some behavioral and cognitive treatments here. Maybe if you try to reinforce a client for any, positive behaviors towards other people, anything that might help develop trust. With the cognitive aspect, trying to help the client identify the specific beliefs they have about other people that lead to this kind of paranoid perspective, and trying to help them see, because this is a difficult issue, there are some people you should not trust. And so acknowledging that a person should be cautious in who they trust, but at the same time also helping them develop trusting relationships with people who have proven themselves trustworthy. So therapy for personality disorders in general typically takes a longer period of time and may be more difficult and complicated than some of the other treatments we've talked about this semester. Drug therapy is an option. Of course, an individual who has paranoid personality disorder may not be willing to take a medication or may not be compliant with that treatment, and so it's kind of limited help there. All right, so paranoid personality disorder is one cluster A disorder, but the next cluster A disorder we're going to talk about is schizoid personality disorder. Now, schizoid personality disorder is basically that person that wants to be left alone. So if you see a person living by themselves on the side of a mountain somewhere, it's possible that that individual has schizoid personality disorder. A persistent avoidance of social relationships and limited emotional expression. Now, a couple things to point out. This is not the individual who doesn't want to be around other people because they're anxious. That's going to be a different disorder we're going to talk about coming up. And this is not the individual who doesn't want to be around other people because they can't help themselves from hurting other people. That's a different diagnosis we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Now, schizoid personality is really just an individual who genuinely prefers to be alone and does not feel like close relationships are necessary or beneficial for them. So these individuals are often seen as being flat, cold, humorless, dull, basically a person who wants to be left alone and kept to themselves. Now, we understand that different people have different levels of tolerance for other people and of wanting to be around others. When we talk about personality traits later, extroversion and introversion are going to come up. But even an introverted person desires social contact to a certain extent. But we're saying a person who has schizoid personality disorder really has next to no, if basically no interest in spending time around other people. Now, this personality disorder is slightly more likely to occur in men than in women, which you could potentially see. Women typically endorse having like stronger feelings about relationships, wanting to be in a relationship, needing more social contact than men, so perhaps this makes sense. All right. How do we treat schizoid personality disorder? Well, a person who has extreme social withdrawal is not likely to want to go to therapy. Just as we talked about, a person who has paranoid personality disorder may distrust the therapist. A person who has schizoid personality disorder just has no interest in the therapist and has no interest in the therapist getting to know the client either. So that makes it very difficult for the therapist to build a relationship, a connection, have a rapport with the client. So it is possible that you could have maybe some behavioral treatments here where we have some goal setting. Maybe there's something in your life where you have to be around people. So let's talk about a goal for something that might make our life a little bit easier or a little bit better, that kind of thing. But for the most part, as with other personality disorders, this kind of treatment is going to be difficult. And then the last of the cluster A personality disorders, or the odd personality disorders, is schizotypal personality disorder. Now, schizotypal personality disorder is similar, as we've said with the others, to schizophrenia, and that these individuals may have just odd ways of thinking and behavior. So the individual who has schizotypal personality disorder probably comes across as a little bit strange. So most people have a few things they do that are a little bit strange. Maybe you have some superstitions or some ritual things that you do perhaps. But a person who has schizotypal personality disorder typically has some very odd ways of thinking. So this may be a person that feels like when it talks about ideas of reference, they're wondering, are the thoughts in my head put there by someone else? Where did this idea come from? Is this a premonition of something that's going to happen in the future? That kind of thing. People may have difficult time focusing, so attention span may be an issue here, which will hurt therapy. It'll be hard to keep a person on track, hard to interview a person who has schizotypal personality disorder. Conversations just kind of all over the place, some loose associations. You see some similarities here to the psychotic disorders that we talked about previously. But in addition to just some odd behaviors and ways of thinking, these individuals often do have some discomfort in close relationships as well. So where do these symptoms come from? How do we explain this? Well, schizotypal personality disorder is, of the three we've talked about, perhaps the most like schizophrenia. The symptoms tend to overlap a pretty good bit. And so perhaps whatever it is that causes schizophrenia is also what causes schizotypal personality disorder. So, for example, we talked about the dopamine hypothesis, about how individuals who have excessive levels of dopamine might be more likely to have psychotic symptoms. The same could be true here as well. It also could potentially be linked to family conflicts, psychological disorders. So think about individuals who are under extreme stress. Perhaps we have a genetic predisposition because of, for example, dopamine issues. And then stress in family relationships at an early age could maybe set the stage for this personality disorder to develop, as well as other disorders, especially perhaps depression. All right, so switching gears to our cluster B or dramatic personality disorders, we're going to talk briefly about 4 disorders here: narcissistic, antisocial, histrionic, and borderline. Now, I think of all of the personality disorders we're going to talk about today, I think the ones that go in the dramatic personality disorder section are probably the ones that we hear people talk about the most. So you may not hear people talk about schizoid personality disorder, but you've heard of narcissism, I'm sure. So when we're talking about dramatic personality disorders, these individuals have behaviors that are very damaging for relationships. So a person who had that odd cluster personality, cluster A personality, may not want to have a relationship with people. An individual who has a dramatic cluster B personality disorder may genuinely deeply desire a relationship with other people, but their behaviors and the symptoms that go along with these disorders make it really hard for them to have a relationship, both a personal relationship as well as a relationship with a psychologist. Now, these personality disorders are more commonly diagnosed. Perhaps it's because we recognize them. Maybe we have better criteria for them, or maybe they do just genuinely happen more often. And antisocial and borderline personality disorders have both received a lot of research, primarily because these 2 disorders may be associated with the most danger of any of the other personality disorders we're going to discuss. Once again, though, we don't know exactly where these come from, and our treatments are not perfect. Just being honest with you guys. So first of all, antisocial personality disorder. I told you guys earlier that a schizoid personality disorder is not a person who isolates themselves because they have a desire to hurt someone else. So they just don't want to be around other people. An antisocial personality disorder, this is an individual who enjoys hurting other people, or at the very least has no real regard for other people's rights. So sometimes the term antisocial just sounds like, I just want to be left alone. No, I just want to be left alone is the schizoid personality disorder. Antisocial is genuinely a person that has no problem with hurting other people. Now, a few things to say here. Not everyone who has antisocial personality disorder is the serial killer stereotype that we have. Having said that, pretty much all of these serial killer stereotypes that we have antisocial personality disorder. It is possible that a person might have this disorder and then not go on to engage in criminal activity. However, we do often see a strong correlation with criminal activity here. Now, the DSM requires a person has to be at least 18 to receive this diagnosis. As I told you guys, it's inappropriate to diagnose children with personality disorders. However, we are going to have a lecture, the next lecture, we're going to talk about disorders of childhood and adolescence, where an individual might start off with maybe conduct disorder. You'll see that in the next lecture. And then once an individual reaches the age of 18, if they're still having the symptoms, then we would diagnose it as antisocial personality. So people with this disorder tend to behave in ways that really just disregard social norms and authority figures. So cheating, lying, stealing, running away, breaking curfew, those kinds of just rule-breaking behaviors. But in addition to that, sometimes behaviors that are intentionally cruel. So this could be a person who is cruel emotionally, so someone who like bullies, but it could also be a person who is cruel physically to another person or to an animal, for example. So antisocial personality disorder has received a lot of research because these individuals are the ones that are perhaps at the greatest risk of being dangerous to other people. When we talked about the 4 Ds earlier in the semester, I said that danger is actually something that's relatively rare when it comes to psychological issues, but antisocial personality disorder would be an exception to that, where an individual would be at an increased risk of being dangerous to other people. We don't know, despite the fact that we have a lot of interest in antisocial personality disorder, we still don't know exactly where it comes from. Psychodynamic perspective would say an absence of parental love. So if a person who has antisocial personality disorder is a person who does not feel empathy for others, doesn't understand other people's emotions. Maybe it's because their parents didn't teach them how to understand other people's emotions, or their parents were not emotionally involved. Is it also possible, though, that there's a behavioral component? Absolutely. Sometimes we see other people engaging in antisocial behavior and we model that. So briefly, there's a lot of talk about violent video games and violence in children, and this is beyond the scope of this class, but what I will say is that that's a correlation. It's a strong enough correlation that we should be cautious with what our children are exposed to. But it's also possible that an individual, instead of having the violent video games cause the violence in children, it's also possible that a child that is naturally more violent would choose violent video games. And then that child that was naturally more violent might start to model the video games, whereas a child playing that video game who is not naturally violent might never consider doing those behaviors in real life. So just something to think about. But also unintentional reinforcement. I think very few times would a parent or teacher or caregiver reinforce intentionally violent behaviors. But what if we're in a situation where the child never receives any kind of attention at all, and then when the child misbehaves in a violent way, they get attention? Even if you think that attention is negative, so you're yelling and you're punishing, that's still attention, and so potentially we could have accidentally reinforced bad behavior. A cognitive view says that the person who has antisocial personality disorder holds some dysfunctional beliefs about other people. Basically, they would then believe that other people's needs are not as important as their needs, about how other individuals are asking for it, or other individuals deserve it, or some kind of justification the person starts to hold that then lets them feel okay about engaging in these kinds of behaviors. Because one of the things we see, it's not just that they hurt other people, but it's also that they typically show very little remorse for it. So they don't feel sorry for hurting another person. Obviously, with an individual that has a disorder as severe as antisocial personality disorder, we often see biological factors here. So serotonin can be an issue. Of course, serotonin is linked to mood disorders, and so an individual might have multiple diagnoses if a person has low serotonin. Also, impulsivity, aggression, kind of generally, probably from an early age, although we would not diagnose an individual with antisocial personality as a child. This doesn't usually come out of the blue. Usually we see symptoms from an early age. And if the symptoms are happening from an early age, then perhaps it's because of a biological issue, not necessarily something that they're modeling. Also, perhaps there could be frontal lobe issues. The frontal lobe of your brain is where your self-control lies. It's where your ability to think and process lies. And so some individuals who have antisocial personality disorder may have deficit functioning. They're just basically, they're having issues in their frontal lobe. And then also, in addition to that, perhaps low levels of anxiety. So although we know that high levels of anxiety are problematic and can cause dysfunction, an individual whose anxiety is on the other end of the spectrum, very low, is a person who's likely to have problems, because a certain level of anxiety is healthy. Without a certain level of anxiety, there would be no concern about breaking the law, breaking the rules. There would be no concern about the future, so people wouldn't save up your money. If you didn't have anxiety, you wouldn't need health insurance because you would think, I'll never get sick. And you wouldn't need a savings account because you would think nothing is ever going to happen. And so perhaps individuals have a low level of anxiety, and that anxiety that they should have would be protective against them engaging in some of these criminal behaviors. All right, switching gears to borderline personality disorder. We're still talking about cluster B or dramatic personality disorders. The basic word, if I had to boil down borderline personality disorder to one word, I would use the word unstable. So these are individuals whose mood, their self-image, their self-esteem, their behavior, their thought processes seem to be a little bit all over the place, basically. And so you can imagine then that a person whose mood is all over the place, a person whose thought processes are all over the place, would also likely have unstable interpersonal relationships. So sometimes people who have borderline personality disorder have a string of violent behaviors or just unhealthy relationships. They have a difficult time connecting with other people in a meaningful way because oftentimes they kind of have this, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you, I want you near me, but I don't want you close to me, pushing the other person away. And you can see how that would make relationships difficult. Sometimes these relationships are violent in nature, but what we see is that people who have borderline personality disorder, while they may be at an increased risk of harming other people, they are definitely at an increased risk of harming themselves. So when you are a psychologist and you have a client who has borderline personality disorder, one of your chief concerns is making sure that you're keeping an eye on suicidal ideation, self-harm behaviors, because many of the individuals who have borderline personality disorder also have at some point had some of those issues as well. This is actually oftentimes how people end up in therapy. So perhaps they have a suicide attempt or other serious self-mutilation, self-injurious behavior, and so they end up going to a hospital and then having some kind of evaluation that suggests that this person should be in therapy. That may be how a person goes to therapy. So basically, a person who has borderline personality disorder has impulsive behaviors that can be dangerous both to themselves and to other people. These are just a few examples, not all of the examples listed here, but things like alcohol and substance abuse, reckless behaviors, things like excessively spending money that a person doesn't have, racking up a considerable amount of debt, driving in ways that are unsafe, which could include driving while under the influence of a substance, unsafe sex, and as I said, behaviors in which the person is harming themselves or thinking about attempting suicide. So obviously there are a lot of challenges when it comes to working with a person who has borderline personality disorder. One of the things that is especially difficult is that people who have borderline personality disorder often have serious abandonment issues. So that then might make it difficult for the person to connect with the psychologist. And then once the person does connect with the psychologist, it may be difficult for that person to end therapy, or to draw appropriate boundaries. So you have to follow the instructions of the APA, at the American Psychological Association, as well as your supervisors when it comes to what is appropriate and what is not appropriate when you develop a relationship with a client. How much do you tell that client about yourself? How much access does that client have to you? Well, with a client who has borderline personality disorder, who has self-injurious behavior tendencies, as well as issues with abandonment, this is where it's very important for you to know the boundaries of what is okay and what's not okay when you're working with a client. Where does borderline personality disorder come from? Well, we do see that a fear of abandonment is I'm not going to say universal, but a very common issue that comes up with borderline personality disorder. So we might try to understand where this fear of abandonment comes from. As you might imagine, a psychodynamic theorist is going to say there's probably an issue with parents here, potentially abuse or neglect. Now, I want to say something very important here when it talks about how there is research to suggest that there's a link between borderline personality disorder and early sexual abuse. First of all, I want to say that this is true, that research has found this link. Now, is it that an individual who has borderline personality disorder develops the symptoms after sexual abuse, or is it that potentially the symptoms then lead to dangerous relationships that might include various types of violence, perhaps? That's something that's harder to understand. But what I do want to say is we should always be careful when we say things like, we see this kind of symptom typically in a person who's been a victim of sexual abuse, because we don't want to implant this idea. Sometimes some different theoretical orientations would suggest that you're just repressing it. So if you have these symptoms, then perhaps that means that there was an assault, and if you don't remember an assault, it was because you repressed it. That can be very dangerous to start planting ideas in people's minds. So I want to be very cautious with saying that although there is some link in the research, this does not mean that everyone who has borderline personality disorder was also a victim of sexual abuse. All right, still talking about cluster B or dramatic disorders, histrionic personality disorder. These are individuals who are extremely vain. I don't know how many of you guys have seen Gone with the Wind. Classic maybe. Scarlett, perhaps, could be diagnosed with a histrionic personality disorder, a constant need to be the center of attention. So these are individuals that often engage in attention-getting behaviors. Perhaps this is the person that feels the constant need to one-up somebody else, or to they always have a story that's better than your story. Or a person that tries to draw attention to themselves, perhaps by the way they behave, by the way they dress, or by the way they post on social media. So I think that histrionic personality disorder is definitely a cultural issue that perhaps is getting more common because of things like social media, perhaps. But these individuals live for praise, and so if a person feels like there is a good chance of them getting praise for a certain behavior, they're likely to engage in that regardless of whether that behavior is healthy or functional for them. They feel like approval is necessary. There was a song, it's an older song, but there's a song, it's like, you're so vain, you probably think this song is about you. Well, that would be a person with histrionic personality disorder. Now, because this is a person who desperately needs the spotlight, they may be very self-centered, and they may be willing to manipulate other people in order to have that spotlight put on them. One way you can see this is with suicide attempts. Now, you always need to pay attention when a person makes a comment that makes you think they might be having suicidal ideation. You never want to say, well, that person is never going to go through with that. It's just something they're doing to get attention. It may truly be something they're doing to get attention, but this is where you don't want to be wrong. So I have had students ask me in the past, how do you respond in that particular situation? If you think that a person is threatening to hurt themselves to get attention. Because normally, if there's a behavior that is not good that a person does to get attention, then behavior modification says ignore that person, and then they won't get the reinforcement, so they'll stop. I'm not going to tell you to ignore the person here, because if you're wrong and if they're doing it for reasons other than to get attention, you may never get a chance to fix this. So I don't recommend that. But also, if you respond in a normal level of concern, that may be reinforcing. So what I have had professors advise me before is to over-respond. If you can't under-respond and you can't respond appropriately, over-respond. If the person is threatening to harm themselves and they're only doing it to get attention, and you say, okay, well, I'm calling an ambulance right now. Every time they say that, you're like, okay, I'm calling an ambulance. If they're doing it just to get attention, then that could potentially discourage that behavior. And then also the other plus is you're always prepared. Overreacting is something that will not leave you wondering if you should have done something else. Let me know if you have any questions about that, just kind of generally touching on that. We should always take people seriously when they're talking about harming themselves. That's the mistake, that's the thing you don't want to get wrong. All right. When we're talking about where histrionic personality disorder comes from, this excessive need for attention, perhaps they talk about the lack of substance, a person who is not a very deep, sincere person, but a person who is extremely suggestible. So a person who is extremely suggestible is that person who likes whatever the person they're with likes. They don't really have a stable personality that is their own. Maybe they change substantially depending on the environment they're in. And maybe the person is just doing that because they're afraid of rejection. So maybe they feel like they can't take care of themselves and they feel like they need to always be surrounded by other people because they really feel like they can't function by themselves. So you would try to help them recognize these thoughts they're having, try to change those if at all possible. But it's also part of society's norms. So I already touched on social media a little bit, but when you create something like social media where people can type something random that's on their mind and then have 600 people like and share and comment, then that's extremely reinforcing. Perhaps we are creating some histrionic traits in the way that we do our relationships. Relationships are more online now than they ever have been before. And I really wonder if we're not creating some of these symptoms. But that's a whole nother tangent that we don't have time for today. So moving on to the last of the dramatic or cluster B personality traits, a person who has narcissistic personality disorder. Now, the term narcissistic comes from mythology, the myth about Narcissus. So not a true story, but a myth about an individual Narcissus who happened by a pool of water, saw his reflection, and thought that he was so attractive, he immediately fell in love with his own reflection. And what happens when you fall in love with your own reflection and refuse to stop looking at yourself? You die. You starve to death. You die of thirst. If a person, I guess you just drink out of the pool you're looking into. But the idea is that this person was so obsessed with himself that it killed him. Well, that's a myth, but also the idea behind narcissistic personality disorder. These are individuals who have a combination of extremely high self-esteem combined with very little empathy for other people. And so these are people who are extremely arrogant, people who are only out for themselves, and people who can be very manipulative of others. So as I said, these individuals are not empathetic, so they're not interested in the feelings of others, and typically do not feel guilty about taking advantage of other people. So this may be a situation where the person who has narcissistic personality disorder mistreats another person terribly. Maybe, for example, they're married, and the partner who has narcissistic personality disorder cheats and abuses and puts down and threatens. And so then when the other person says, I've had enough, and they leave, then they say, oh, well, see, you're just not a kind, loving person. If you were a kind, loving person, you wouldn't leave me like that. They don't have a problem with hurting other people, taking advantage of other people to get what they want. So basically, this is a very young child. This is a toddler that never grows up. basically, because we see this. It talks about how this kind of behavior is normal in teenagers, it's normal in children, because their frontal lobe has not developed, and it's hard for them to take other people's perspectives. But at a certain point, at a certain age, we expect people to be able to understand the feelings of others and to not take advantage of other people. And someone who has narcissistic personality disorder continues to engage in those juvenile behaviors. Now, what we do see is that this behavior is much more common, or this diagnosis is much more common in men than it is in women. And perhaps this goes back to relationship issues. We typically teach our daughters empathy a little bit more than we do our sons. So perhaps that is part of it. So one theory about where this comes from is that perhaps parents and others are excessively positive towards their children. Now, this sounds strange. A lot of our theories about where psychological problems come from would be abusive parents who are not loving. But is it possible that we treat children too positively? Maybe from an early age, an individual is taught that the world revolves around them. You might think Veruca Salt. You guys have seen or read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Maybe we are creating little Veruca Salts here with the way that we parent children and the way that we don't force children to take personal responsibility, perhaps. But also, there is a possibility here that it could be the opposite thing. It could be a person who has extremely low self-esteem, and so they engage in this narcissistic behavior to try to build themselves up, to try to compensate for that. Maybe genuinely inside they dislike themselves, but they behave this way to try to make themselves feel better. That's a possibility as well. Now, also, is there a link between our society and narcissistic personality disorder? Well, perhaps. As we get more into an era of not wanting to upset other people, and so not really having high standards, wanting everyone to be successful at everything, then perhaps we are creating some of this in future generations, perhaps. And then the last type of personality disorder, so the anxious personality or cluster C, involves obsessive compulsive personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, and dependent personality disorder. Now, when we talk about people who have anxious personality disorders, you might start to ask yourself, what's the difference between a person who has an anxiety disorder and an anxious personality disorder? Well, it's a little bit similar to what we talked about with the person who has an odd personality disorder and schizophrenia. So we're going to see that these individuals have very high trait anxiety, not necessarily high state anxiety. The difference is that a state anxiety is something that's triggered by something in the environment. So you're really stressed out about money, or you're really stressed out about a test. But a person who has high trait anxiety is really stressed out all the time. Like, anxiety is just part of their nature. You know, I'm sure you know, or you are one of these, some of you guys know these individuals who are just extremely anxious all the time about everything. So what we're going to see here is that these individuals may be the ones who are most helped by our treatments. Maybe it's because a person who is anxious is a person who wants to seek out treatment, or maybe it's because we know so much about treating anxiety disorders that they could also be helpful with treating anxious personality disorders. So the first one we're going to talk about is avoidant personality disorder. So this is a cluster C personality disorder similar to social phobia, where with social phobia we see that a person is afraid of social situations. Could be public speaking, could be eating in front of other people. But what we see is that people who have avoidant personality disorder, they have some anxious symptoms in close social relationships. It's not just, I don't want to be in front of people. It is, I am afraid to date someone. So I'm afraid to be friends with someone. It's not just about being in public, it's about being with people at all. Now, this is not a person with schizoid personality disorder who doesn't want to be around other people. This is a person who desperately wants to be around other people, but is afraid to be around other people. So where does this come from? As you might imagine, psychodynamic theorists are going to focus on perhaps something that comes from your parents. So maybe your parents shamed you too much as a child, and so because of that, you have low self-esteem. A similar idea would come from cognitive theorists who would say people are afraid of criticism. They have some maladaptive beliefs about criticism, about people are always judging me, people are always watching me, people are never happy with me. And when you have that kind of belief, it makes it hard to be comfortable around other people. And then a behavioral perspective is that perhaps you just don't have good social skills. And then because you have poor social skills, you've had bad experiences. So someone who doesn't have typical social skills is someone who might have been bullied, or someone who might have been ignored or rejected. So you've been punished for trying to engage with other people. So then we need to teach you social skills so that you can now be reinforced when you try to interact with other people. All right, so an individual who has avoidant personality disorder is someone who is afraid to be in relationships. A person who has dependent personality disorder is someone who is afraid not to be in a relationship. So these are individuals who feel like they need to be taken care of by other people. And so they would be very anxious about the potential end of a relationship because they feel like they can't function away from the person that they are kind of clinging to. So these individuals tend to be clingy. Maybe they're clingy to a family member. So an individual at a certain age, you expect a separation to a certain point from parents. But this may be an individual who still has an excessively close relationship with a parent. But it could also be someone who is dependent on a friendship, dependent on a romantic relationship. And one of the key things you see is that a person may become unable to make decisions. So they feel like someone else has to always make the decisions for them. They feel like they have to consult other people before they make decisions. Now, as you can imagine, a person who feels like they cannot function on their own is likely to feel very distressed by this. You're at an increased risk for depression, anxiety, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, because if you feel like you cannot function without other people or maybe a specific person, anything that might suggest that relationship is not doing well will cause extreme anxiety. And if that relationship ends, if a person passes away, or if a person breaks up with the individual, that person might start to have very severe depression and anxiety. Now, what we see surprisingly here is that men and women are affected equally. You might have expected to see this more in women, and we do have a stereotype of women being more clingy and being more likely to have anxiety disorders, but we actually see that men and women are affected in roughly equal amounts. Where does this come from? Well, one of our strongest, at least based on our research, one of our best ideas is that a parent might either intentionally or unintentionally induce this in a child. So if you're a parent, it feels good to have your child cling to you. Like, I need you, I love you, you make me feel safe. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there is a certain point where a parent has to encourage their child to have some independence, encourage their child to spend time with other people too, and encouraging their child to do things on his or her own. And sometimes parents are so afraid of that they try to keep their child from doing things on their own and being independent. Or it could be that a parent might also be dependent. So a parent could be dependent on their own parents. So as a child, if you see your mother clinging to her mother, that might make you more likely to cling to your mother, for example. It's also possible that there are some cognitive issues here. So a person who feels like they are helpless and then also feels like I can get the help I need from another person is someone who might have dependent personality disorder. I cannot do it on my own. I must have another person protect me. That kind of thinking then puts the person at risk for anxiety and depression and issues when relationships are potentially threatened. And so that person might feel like even if the relationship is unhealthy, they can't leave the relationship because they feel like they need that person. So once you start to feel that way, you're not likely to try to be independent or to try to leave a relationship. And unfortunately, a person might be taken advantage of. So imagine what would happen if a person who had narcissistic personality disorder was in a relationship with a person who had dependent personality disorder. So one person, the person who has narcissism, obsessively needs to be needed and to be, built up and to have everybody do exactly what they want. And the person who has dependent personality disorder is so afraid of the relationship ending that they would do whatever it takes to please the other person. You can see how some of these personality disorders would combine in some interesting situations. I'll leave it at that. And then obsessive compulsive personality disorder, as it sounds, has some components in common with obsessive compulsive personality, with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. The difference is that you don't see the obsessions and the compulsions so much as just a person who is extremely rigid. We talked a little bit with OCD about a person who has to have things a certain way, and that can make a person come across as being very rigid, maybe having very strict morals, for example, or very strong perfectionist tendencies. So this is what we see with a person who has obsessive compulsive disorder. They are preoccupied with perfection and control. So I would imagine, I don't know the research on this, but I would imagine this is associated with certain careers. I could see that a CEO could have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. The trouble is the person may be reinforced for this because it may work out well for them to be very rigid. What we see, though, is a person who is very rigid and obsessed with control and has to be perfect is not usually a very affectionate person, open to compromise, and so this can greatly harm their personal relationships. One other thing that makes OCD different from OCPD is that with OCD, the person is usually distressed. Like, I don't know why. I had a professor explain this to me one time. OCD is, I can't stop rearranging my desk and I don't know what's wrong with me. And OCPD is, I can't stop rearranging my desk and I don't know what's wrong with you because you should be doing it the way I'm doing it. So usually they feel like their behaviors are good because they feel like it makes them in control and perfect. And so if they don't think that there's something wrong, they may not seek out treatment unless there's another issue going on. So this may be a person who is very resistant to suggestion. If you're a type A perfectionist person, having a psychologist tell you that something you're doing is wrong might not go over very well. Now, sometimes these individuals receive psychodynamic therapy, receive cognitive therapy, or a combination of therapy with an SSRI. So selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors have some success in treating OCD, but can also be helpful with OCPD as well. Now, I told you guys that this is the way that the DSM-5 classifies personality disorders, but there's some concerns with the way we classify personality disorders. Specifically, who gets to say when a personality is disordered? This is highly dependent on the psychologist. The psychologist says you have abandonment issues. You have a lack of empathy. Well, there's not exactly a checklist for what abandonment issues looks like. So there's a lot of clinical intuition where the psychologist is making this call about what's right and what's wrong. So maybe we don't have enough direct, specific criteria here to make a good diagnosis. And also because, for example, people who have one type A personality disorder or cluster A may have several different symptoms from several different cluster A disorders. So is there really just one disorder, cluster A? Is that one disorder? Or what if a person has symptoms from several different disorders but doesn't have enough symptoms from one particular disorder to warrant a diagnosis? So it gets a little bit messy. The DSM-5 has a categorical approach. You either have this disorder or you don't have this disorder. It's a checklist. You have this symptom, you don't have this symptom. You have this disorder, you don't have this disorder. And it also assumes that if you don't have enough symptoms to meet criteria, you don't have a disorder, so it must not be causing you any distress. that is done because it makes research easier, but that's not necessarily the best way to go about diagnosing personality disorders. So fear not, we have an idea for a potentially different approach that was almost adopted in DSM-5, but they decided at the last minute to just include it as something they're considering for the future, not something they accepted at this moment. We're going to get into what that is specifically in just a second, but before I do, I have to say a word about personality traits. So we said that your personality is something unique to you that is relatively consistent but also flexible. Research suggests that the bulk of our personality is made up of a combination of 5 personality traits, and these are sometimes called the Big Five. And then you would either be high or low on each of these. Now, if you're having a hard time remembering them, this is not the order they're on this slide, but there is an acronym, OCEAN. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So you would be either high or low on each one of these, and then that would determine the bulk of your personality. So, first of all, neuroticism basically refers to a person being emotionally stable. So someone high on neuroticism is someone who has a lot of emotions that are all over the place. And this could be something like anger, but it could also be something like anxiety. A person who, when we're talking about extroversion, if a person is highly extroverted, this is a person who relaxes best when they're around other people. So everybody needs social contact to a certain extent. But a person who is extroverted feels like they need that social contact to help them relax, to help them unwind. They really are themselves most when they're around other people. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, a person low on extroversion, which we might also call an introvert, is a person who feels like, although they do want social contact to a certain extent, they feel like they're able to relax and be themselves most when they're by themselves. Openness to experience, just like it sounds, are you a spontaneous person that enjoys trying new things? Or are you the person who orders the same thing at the same restaurant every time you go out? That kind of thing. Agreeableness, pretty straightforward. Do you get along well with other people? Do you play nice with other kids? And conscientiousness refers to responsibility. A person high on conscientiousness is a person who is dependable. You pay the bills on time, come to work, show up, do what you're supposed to do. A person low on conscientiousness would be a person with less responsibility. So basically we're saying your personality is a combination of these factors, and based on some research there seems to be relatively true. And then the other aspects of who you are kind of fall into subcategories beneath those. So there is a suggestion that we could have what we could call a personality disorder trait specified. This is something we might use in a future version of the DSM. Instead of saying you have narcissistic personality disorder or you have antisocial personality disorder, we might say you have a personality disorder, and then we list the specific traits that seem to be problematic. Now, in addition to listing the specific traits, we would also list the severity of those traits. How much of a problem is this? This would allow a person who has a personality disorder, who has symptoms across the clusters, to have all of their symptoms recognized instead of only recognizing the ones that the person meets full criteria for. Now, of course, in order to do this, when we talk about personality disorder traits specified, we have to talk about what specific traits. So there are 5 general categories that we might think about here. We might say you have a personality disorder with symptoms of negative affectivity. This is your mood. This is your emotion. A person is having anxiety, or a person is having anger, perhaps. We might say one of the traits you have problems with, you have detachment. So this is that social withdrawal that you see sometimes in the odd personality disorders, not wanting to be around other people. Maybe you have an antagonistic approach towards other people. So think narcissism here. You are manipulating other people. You are not considering other people, not feeling empathy. We might say you have a personality disorder and you have a problem with disinhibition. This is that impulsivity. You have a hard time sticking with a plan, making a plan. Your decision making is a little bit all over the place. Or we might say you have some symptoms that are more psychotic-like, so like the cluster A, where you have a person who's having some things that are similar to delusions or similar to hallucinations. So basically we would say you have a personality disorder. These are some of the specific symptoms you seem to be having, instead of feeling like we have to force people into specific personality disorder categories. People don't always fit in a box. Alright, so lots of information in this lecture video. This is actually your last activity, activity 12. Remember what I've been saying, that you get credit for your top 10 activities. So if you have full credit on 10 activities so far, you don't really benefit from doing activity 12. But if you missed one or two, or if you didn't get full credit for one or two, then doing all these activities is helpful to your grade. So activity 12 asks you to consider, where does personality come from? First of all, what influences your personality? And then second of all, I want you to discuss whether or not you feel comfortable diagnosing a person with a personality disorder. Is it okay to say, you, at the core of who you are, there's something wrong with that? So on the one hand, you might say, yes, it's ethical because of research and because of insurance, and it allows us to treat. Or you might say it's unethical because personality is unique and personality is different, and so we shouldn't judge other people's personality. But I just want your perspective on that. So that is the end of today's lecture video. There was a lot of information today, so please feel free to let me know if you have any questions about the activity or about any of the material. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys during our next and last lecture video on disorders of childhood. So I'll talk to you guys then.